We've been lucky to see some of the best heavyweight fighters in all of UFC history in some of the most recent years, but some of them stand out on top and rise above the rest, defying all odds and proving their worth in the octagon. Let's take a look at some of the best fighters in the heavyweight class, starting with Junior Dos Santos at 7. We can't start the list off without talking about the very fighter that's been able to, ever since Brock Lesnar, win on every heavyweight champion out there, both interim and undisputed. We're of course talking about Junior Dos Santos. Admittedly, he went through a short victory at the top of his division. Despite that, he was one of the biggest names out there, and no one could dare to stand in his path during that time. Even after his defeat, the fight was a huge name as one of the elites in the sport several years after his demise. His defeat was brought in by none other than Velasquez, who got a unanimous decision from the judges in the fight between them and ended up winning his title back. That doesn't mean he isn't worth mentioning. The fight first signed on in the UFC back in 2008, where he knocked out Fabricio Werdum, the future UFC champion and the Pride import. From then on, the player had no place in his career to make any mistakes, since he was up against fighters rising just as fast, such as Roy Nelson, and even up against some of the longest reigning experts out there, like Gilbert Yvel. While some people wanted to make him a contender as soon as he beat Werdum, the UFC decided to make him work for it, though the fighter still managed to beat everyone up until he finally won the title from Cain Velasquez in just 69 seconds. He's still considered one of the best the organization has ever had to offer. Next up at 6, Mark Coleman. We'll have to return to the UFC's earlier days for Coleman. When the organization first started up, they'd usually bring in fighters from all kinds of sports, combat sports to be specific, to make them fight against one another and see who could win. But soon, all forms of martial arts started to mix in with one another, as they'd been used in the cage, and fighters kept adding their techniques to the combat sport they were familiar with, just to get an edge in the Pentagon. Why exactly is Mark Coleman someone special in all of this when everyone was changing the game? While Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighters started boxing, kickboxers learned about submissions, and karateka started wrestling, the fight took a completely different approach. Ground and pound is precisely what he started to add in, something that was only possible in MMA, instead of going over to adopt things from other styles. This is the very same unique skill set and style that got him one of the most feared fighters in his 2 UFC tournaments, along with him being crowned as the very first heavyweight champion in the UFC. Because of his background in Olympic wrestling, Coleman was one of the most feared people in the early days of the UFC, who would constantly headbutt and hammer fist his opponents. If they still managed to survive, they'd just get forced to tap out of them with his insane submissions. But the fighter decided to drop out of the UFC after he lost 3 fights in a row. Moving on to Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira at 5. What can we say about Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira that everyone who's ever watched the UFC doesn't already know? He's probably the best fighter in the MMA in his era. While that may not sound like a big achievement, it is. Even when he wasn't up against some of the biggest names in the sport at the time, he'd be out making a name for himself by giving us fights that not a single one of us has been able to forget, such as a showdown with Bob Sapp back in 2002. The fighter was part of the UFC for an entire decade, from 1999 to 2009. Some of his highlight fights include bouts against Fabricio Werdum, Mark Coleman, Mirko Krokop, Randy Couture, and many more. He wouldn't have been able to get this big without having some incredible submission skills in his arsenal, leading up to a bunch of trophies that almost no one in the organization can match. Though he was just short of officially being the GOAT as the next generation of heavyweight fighters started joining in, he surely has a legacy no one can even dare to touch. While he was at the peak of his career, he was going to take the spot of the greatest heavyweight fighter in the history of MMA. But even if he fell short of what was expected from him, he put up a career better than most fighters out there could even dream about. Additionally, at 4, Cain Velasquez. Let's talk about another fighter who could have been the greatest fighter of all time, someone with the potential and the resume for it. Of course, we're talking about Cain Velasquez, who seemed like he wanted to be the very best out there since the start of his career, and because of that, brought along a bunch of incredible fights to us. But it seems like we won't be able to see much of him in the ring anymore, since the last time he fought regularly was in 2011, and injuries got the better of him, leading to him not participating for a few years at this point. The fighter first started in the first division of the NCAA, and just 2 fights later, he was signed onto the UFC and managed to knock Brad Morris out in almost 2 minutes. From the very start of his career, we knew he was a force to be reckoned with, and we were right, as the fighter ended up among the top contenders just 3 years after debuting as a pro. He even went up against Brock Lesnar in 2011 and destroyed his opponent. That was the very fight that earned him the UFC heavyweight title at UFC 121. While he might have lost that title to Junior Dos Santos in the same year, he got his revenge by destroying him in the rematch they had back in 2012 and the Rummer match from 2013. It's sad that someone with as much potential as Velasquez had to take his career off because of injuries. Furthermore, Randy Couture at 3. Not every day we see someone start their MMA career when they're over 30 years old and still make their way to being some of the best fighters in the sport. But his career was by no means just a lucky strike. The fighter still had some incredible skills from wrestling back in college. Not just that, but he was a really fast learner and would make techniques and skills that, at the time, were super innovative. But he was still kind of a mixed bag. While he won the UFC champion title 5 times, his overall record isn't that great, and even his longest win streak consists of just 4 fights. But even though he started his career at 33 years of age, because he was such a fast learner, his skills were all he needed to go up against some of the biggest names out there at the time and still win. He had a 14-year-long career and won his 3rd championship title when he was 43, and that was against Tom Sylvia. He's also brought along a lot of incredible memories for fans of the sport, and it begs the question of just how good his career could have been if he had just started earlier. Maybe he would have indeed been the greatest heavyweight in the history of MMA. Or maybe it would have been too soon, and he needed time to mature his mindset and skills before taking on the best out there. Moreover, at 2, Josh Barnett. There's something unique about combat sports, especially MMA, where careers can go on for longer because power is the only thing that matters in the end. The former UFC heavyweight champion, Josh Barnett, is another one of those cases of fighters that stick around for too long and end up going up against newer fighters or even in international leagues. Though his record in the MMA is full of some of the biggest names out there, from multiple generations of fighters in the history of the MMA, and that's what sets him apart, that he was still able to go up against the best of the best even so late into his career. While he didn't win all of his fights, we all expected that to happen, but even though he was so far into his career, he didn't get all fussy like other fighters and was always down to fight against anyone. The biggest fights in his 21-year career include Dan Severn and Randy Couture, along with more recent fighters such as Daniel Cormier and Mark Hunt. Surprisingly, he could keep his career going for over 2 decades. Finally, Fyodor Emelianenko at number 1. Now, let's talk about someone we all agree is the single best talent in the history of the sport, Fyodor Emelianenko. Let's start by talking about his resume, which is full-on stacked with championship titles and so much more that it would take all day to list it all down. Even if we look at his career from 2000 to 2009, he had only 1 loss with a record of 31-1. He also lost because of an illegal elbow that brought in a vicious TKO through a doctor's stoppage. The fighter could do everything with a level of skill that was unmatched by anyone, and he could wrestle better against wrestlers, outstrike strikers, and even defeat grapplers at their own game. He still had enough skill and determination to find a way out of any problem in the ring, no matter what. The fighter didn't just want to win every fight he was in. He wanted to make sure that his point was proven in every bout and would demolish his opponents at their own game. But his fighting style was much more similar to a middleweight fighter than a heavyweight fighter. Because of that, he's considered the best fighter in the sport's history, and no one out there can say otherwise. His career speaks for itself. That's a wrap for this video. What are your thoughts about the fighters? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.